coming today. Okay. Though it's tempting to think of a saint as someone whose mind and soul were more important than their body, we cannot ignore the importance of the physical, especially in the context of a medieval retelling of a saint's life. The body and the transformation throughout Rutebeuf's version of La vie de Sainte Marie l'Égyptienne is highly significant and fascinating. Because Marie l'Égyptienne commences her life as a sinner, we can see in her history both the sinful and saintly body in one saint. Of course, the body is essential in a multitude of saint and miracle stories, and the importance of holy relics, often pieces of bodies of saints, in medieval society is proof in and of itself that the saintly body is vital even beyond death. In this presentation, I seek to underline the diverse states and transformations of the body of Saint Mary of Egypt, because these saints who begin their lives as sinners, I'm going to give you an overview of her life. She sins at the beginning of her life. They have this really unusual appeal to the reader. Their faults at the beginning of their lives serve to further valorize the sainthood that they have at the end. The audience is really kind of meant to be titillated and disapproving of this before version of the saint, and then they'll end up being impressed and inspired by the transformation that they go through. So Brigitte Cazal said in a quote that actually has inspired the title of my presentation, that loin d'éternir l'éclat final, l'imperfection en est une étape nécessaire. I'm trying to see if I know how to use this thing. Aha! Okay, so here's an English translation. Far from tarnishing the final gleam, imperfection is a necessary stage. This transformation from necessary imperfection to perfect sainthood is perhaps even essential to their ability to end up in a state of holiness. We can find many examples of these saintly characters who have never sinned with their body, but their histories perhaps do not affect the audience as viscerally. It's the people who hit rock bottom who eventually have the possibility of attaining a truly impressive level of sainthood. So I'd like to suggest that in Rutebeuf's story of Sainte Marie l'Égyptienne, Mary must transform and transcend her body over multiple stages. And this process is different from the trajectory of saints, and particularly female saints, who are pious and good from the beginning until the end of their lives. I'd like to focus on the question of where her sin comes from, according to Rutebeuf, by which I mean, is it the conduct of her body that is making her soul saintly or sinful, or can the soul be sinful in and of itself, and then be the source of this bad conduct? The answer is not really clear in La vie de Sainte Marie l'Égyptienne. So to explore these questions and to examine this transformative corporeal journey of Mary of Egypt, I will speak of the problem of the cause and effect in the citations that deal with the source of this sin, of the problematic beauty that she has, and of the physical rejection of her body by the world that surrounds her, and also some of her self-destructive processes, including self-starvation. I'll also compare a little bit with Zosimas, who's a saint in his own right that appears in this story. But first, again, it might be useful to summarize the life of Marie l'Égyptienne as told by Rutebeuf, because there's, of course, multiple versions. In this version, Mary of Egypt is a beautiful young girl, probably of noble birth, and she's described as being irritating to Jesus, and runs away from home at the age of 12 to Alexandria, where she leads a life of sexual promiscuity. One day she encounters a group of pilgrims, and she decides to accompany them on their journey toward Jerusalem. And she does this by exchanging the use of her body for passage on the ship. And when she arrives at the church where the pilgrims are going to adore the cross where Jesus was crucified, the church doors will not open for her. The church actually physically pushes her body away. She kind of is just physically flies backwards several blocks, I guess you would say. And she realizes at this point that she's devoted her life to sinning. And so she prays to the Virgin Mary, changes her ways, and she goes to become a hermit. Far away from humanity, she prays, she starves herself, she becomes kind of a wild woman, essentially. And then Zosimas, a monk who has problems of his own, will find her and eventually bear witness to her saintliness. And when she dies, a lion will dig a grave for her, and her body will be kind of perfumed and it doesn't decompose. So to begin, I would like to address the question of the source of her sins. We have the impression that it's not the body of Mary of Egypt that is sick, because Rutebeuf writes, and I'm going to read them in English. I have the Old French at bottom, very small if that interests you. But anyway, she was sick and then she got better. Her sickness was of the soul. Never have you heard of a woman whose soul was so dishonorable. Not even Mary Magdalene. She led a debauched, stained life. So this kind of implies that the soul is sick and not the body. But we'll see it's the body that manifests the signs of sinfulness. We can assume that his statement here is meant to be from the narrator, but it becomes more complicated because Mary of Egypt gives her own interpretation of her malady. And she says, because of my body, which is stained and vile, my soul will be put in hell, and my body as well after the final judgment. My sin is written across my brow. In either situation, there seems to be a cause and effect, but it's not always clear, especially when we have the voice of the narrator and the voice of Mary in each quote. And we first hear that the body of this woman is just perfect in beauty, and it's the soul that's sinful. And so the comportment of her body must be because of the sickly soul. That would make the body the effect, the soul the cause. But when Mary of Egypt speaks, she says that her soul will be put in hell because of her body, on which the sin has been written. And so in her opinion, it's the body that's the source of the sin, and the soul that becomes sinful as a result. Further complicating the situation, we see that for her, sin is a stain on her body, but a stain that must not be seen by others, as she is always described throughout the text as being very beautiful. And there's something fascinating about this cause and effect problem of her malady, because her body, as I said, remains beautiful even as she continues to sin. Her physical appearance has been given to her, one would imagine, by God in this concept, but her beauty is also written as being an irritation to God. Rutebeuf is saying that she greatly irritated her Savior. At the age of 12, she's beautiful. What else can I say? Outside, she was perfect and all that had to do with the body, but her heart was vain and fickle. A few words were enough to change her. So in this case, the beauty on the exterior is like a mask that hides her heart and soul, which are corrupted by vanity. Beauty is not bad in and of itself, but the problem with Mary of Egypt is that her body and her beauty do not match her interior, that is, her soul. We'll come back to this question of beauty more than once in this presentation. So her body is stained with sins, potentially 3 types of sins, but there's kind of this element that's a little odd because Rutebeuf explains 2, but then the 3rd is not very clear. And her body is simultaneously perfect and stained. Rutebeuf says that people see her beauty and not her soul, but he still uses these stains that maybe are supposed to be metaphorical or invisible to the human eye. And I like this idea because it's sort of like the people can read the body of Mary of Egypt, and when they first see her, they might have thought that she's a good person because of her beauty. But if they could see these invisible stains, they would have been aware of this reflection of what's actually happening in her soul. And so we also see that this beauty is something of a trap, because she uses her beauty to proposition pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. She uses it to get the things that she needs on her way. So if a man or a woman is particularly good looking, they've been created in the image of God, they must be in some way a part of God, and yet the beauty is described in this text as being very dangerous and even the tool of a demon, possibly, who makes men want to sin. Now, all of it depends on the action of the individual, but in the case of Mary of Egypt, we'll see that her natural beauty is eventually written as being incompatible with her sainthood. Because it's when she tries to repent that she essentially loses her beauty. She goes into a forest and her body is stripped bare. It's a very long description, I won't use the quote for it, but essentially she becomes like this wild woman. She's naked, her hair gets long. In some versions, we'll see some of the images, hair grows from all over her body. It's not at all sensual. So before, she was said as using her body to seduce, but as a hermit, even though she's completely nude at all times, it's not sensual, it's not sexual. Her nudity is stripped of eroticism, and I think that's because she has begun her trajectory towards sainthood and toward penitence. And so the appearance of the body and her emotional stability are no longer important. Her focus has shifted in the text to an apprenticeship of saintliness. But an element about this that I would be interested if you have input or questions about, I find it very curious, is that her skin in the text turns black. And this is something you can see in more than one saint story. Not again. There we go. Okay. This is the old French text, but her skin was black like the foot of a swan. Her arms, her long fingers, her hands were blacker at least than pitch or ink. She trimmed her fingernails with her teeth. You would have said that she had no stomach, for she never put any food inside. So her body has been transformed, and more specifically, her skin is now black. So this is an interesting change, because lots of times you see these images of saints as being very pale, very white skin, but in this case, the fact that she has changed the color of her skin, it doesn't really necessarily represent anything to do with the opposite of saintliness, because it happens as she begins her trajectory toward penitence. So I've come up with various things from as simple as she's in the forest, she's naked, she's going to be rolling around in the mud. But I think it's more important than that maybe this darkness of the skin in this text is representing some sort of intermediary step like an exteriorized sign that the body it's been marked in an obvious manner, that she has this struggle going on inside to save her soul. And so it may kind of further that idea of being able to read the sins of someone on the body of the sinner. In this case, you'd be reading the saintly struggle. Okay, but then after her death, her body actually regains or maybe retains some of its beauty. She's been purified by these years of penitence, and her body does not decompose. God took care to protect her so well that her flesh did not decay. And in addition, the body itself has a pleasant and perfumed odor. When he prayed to Jesus Christ, as we find in the text, in the great brightness, greatly perfumed, he saw she whom he loved so much. Thus, in her ultimate and terminal stage, Mary of Egypt's body is finally as beautiful as her soul, now that she has transformed her soul. And so it seems there's this idea that there's God protecting her body after death. And since her beauty is now the result of divine intervention instead of her original state, it becomes acceptable instead of being an irritation or an affront. Okay. Next, I would like to talk about the ways that her body is physically rejected by the earth and by the church. This is something that Rutebeuf writes about many times. It's like the sea and the church. They become these personified characters who would either swallow up or reject the body of Mary of Egypt. For example, at one point, when she is trying to she's getting on a boat to go to Jerusalem, he says, "I am truly astonished that the sea, which is clean and pure, could have suffered her sin, her filth, and that hell did not swallow her up, or at least the earth when she got off the boat." Rutebeuf believes that because of this bad behavior of her body, the earth and the sea would really want to swallow up her body and bury her, maybe kind of bring her down to hell, I guess you could say. And it's fascinating to read that the earth on which Mary of Egypt walks does not want to support the weight of such a sinner. Her body is unbearable in this sense, weighed down by this multitude of sins. And as I mentioned before, the church also is going to reject the body of Mary of Egypt. She could in no way put her feet on the steps, but instead, as if she had drawn back of her own will involuntarily, she found in the crowd, she was right back where she started from. She set forth again and advanced without any better result, over and over. So in some ways, I kind of actually find this a humorous image in some ways, that she keeps trying to go to the church and then is thrown back multiple times. But in any case, the church will not accept that something so unholy should penetrate into a sacred place. Her body is considered so sinful that it cannot go into this church. And of course, this is when she realizes what has happened, that she has never served God. She says that she has been enslaving her body to sin for the destruction of the soul. And she even remarks, "The earth should collapse under me. My body is not worthy because of my sin, which weighs me down." So again, it's this body that is being written of as a tool for good or evil. And Mary of Egypt, again, says that the earth should in fact swallow her up or collapse underneath her and be unwilling to support this weight. So then when she begins her trajectory towards sainthood, the relationship changes and becomes more complicated because she actually is suspended in the air while she is praying. So this time she's being rejected in a way, but in an upward direction. It's kind of like is attracting like in this sense. When she is sinful, she's pulled downward. When she is making this trajectory towards sainthood, she is pulled upward and elevated toward heaven. And let's see, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm going to have too much to tell you. Let's see. Okay. So in each case, when she is a sinner and when she is a saint, the earth cannot support the weight of her body, but for opposing reasons. Beforehand, she's too worldly, she uses her body, neglects her soul, and it's for this reason the earth wants to swallow her up. It's as if it wishes to integrate her worldly body into its, by definition, worldly material. And even though she retains her living body during her penitence, it's during a moment where she unveils her saintliness and the worthiness of her soul that the earth rejects her. And then you can see this again if I skip forward a little bit. There's a quote, "Mary went with Mary." And so there's this idea that she's integrating herself into this more heavenly material. And of course it's referring to Mary of Egypt is going with the Virgin Mary. She's no longer a sinner. She's able to be kind of integrated into that holy material. And so there's also this element of the visibility of her body is important because beforehand was essentially, she was like public property in a sense, as a courtesan. And so now she's separating herself from this world in order to hide herself and to be sanctified. Okay. We also should consider the element of the physical punishment that causes her body to become uglier. She denies herself comfort. She's frequently seen as malnourishing herself. She has very little food to sustain herself during her journey, only 3 small loaves of bread. And you can see that frequently in the iconography of Mary of Egypt. In her statues, she frequently has 3 loaves of bread. So often, again, if you can see some of these pictures here, here's a couple of statues where she has the loaves. And it also, as I mentioned before, she frequently has this emaciated appearance. Here you have Zosimas and Mary of Egypt, because she isn't eating very much. She's not at all sexualized. And so, in that respect, I would kind of like to suggest that Mary of Egypt and maybe other female saints must lose part of their femininity to follow this bodily model that is more masculine in order to achieve penitence. Because when Zosimas first sees her, he's not even sure if he's seen a man or a woman. He says he saw a shadow as far as he could tell. He saw the shadow of a man or a woman. And so this leads me to think that Rutebeuf sees Mary of Egypt as androgynous, or even masculinized by her self-destructive tendencies. So that a body separates a saint from their soul, but the female body in this sense is a much more difficult barrier to saintliness, in part because of medieval assumptions about the desire inspired by the visibility of the human body, or the female body. We have already seen how a saint such as Mary of Egypt needed to separate herself from the view of the world in order to become invisible. But there are other, even more extreme methods than this solitude to protect one's body from debauchery. And we can see some other examples of women that destroy their body during this trajectory, where they get rid of these feminine elements in order to masculinize themselves. And this is the part, I'm very interested in this. I don't know if any of you have heard of Saint Wilgefortis. Yes, no, maybe? Well, she is a fascinating character. This is Mary of Egypt again. If I get the picture. Mary and Mary. Oh, this is another. Mary Magdalene is also portrayed as being hairy sometimes, so also kind of masculinized. Oh, okay, here we go. Saint Wilgefortis. So, Saint Wilgefortis is someone who prays to God to make her ugly in order to put off a pagan who wants to marry her, and God responds to her prayers by giving her a beard. And so her father, who is angry, orders that she be crucified. Now, this story is not true. Essentially, what actually happened is somebody saw a statue of a crucified Christ figure, and it looked kind of feminine, so they thought it was actually a woman. They thought, oh, it's a bearded woman, and they made up a story to go along with it. But nevertheless, this is an example of a story of someone who truly masculinizes themselves in order to avoid something that they don't want. This transformation is essential to her story, even if the story has no basis in fact. So for her and other female saints, beauty is a barrier and a torment. And this comparison is fascinating because Wilgefortis is someone who is pure throughout her entire life, and so her beauty is something that frustrates and impedes her as it attracts men. Mary of Egypt, however, is a sinner at the beginning, and as we have already seen, her beauty is a tool to make others sin, but she has no desire to destroy her beauty until she wishes to repent. As Wilgefortis is a bearded woman, the representations of Mary that are possibly confusions between Mary of Egypt and Mary Magdalene also show body hair on a woman, as we've seen some of the previous slides. This is Mary Magdalene. A lot of times there's a little confusion between who you're actually supposed to be looking at. But I think that these could potentially follow this idea of a masculinized female saint. So in trying to closely examine the problem of beauty, it seems that among the female saints born beautiful, there is a difference between 2 possible narratives. Many saints are born into higher social classes with an astonishing beauty, and yet after these basic elements, the narratives separate. Some of these saints are exemplary women who increase their saintliness over the years, and it's these women who hate their beauty and who, often when they're pursued by pagan suitors, mutilate their bodies. However, a woman such as Mary of Egypt, who has benefited from her beauty, destroys it not because it's something she hates, but because the destruction of this beauty was necessary to stop sinning. And for just a quick final point, it's interesting to note that Zosimas is also in the story, and he is a saint in the Orthodox tradition. And in a lot of the versions of this story, especially the Greek and Latin sources, will focus on his life and not Mary of Egypt. Mary of Egypt becomes kind of this subordinate character, whereas in this version, of Rutebeuf's version, it's really her who's the most important. And this is interesting because the spiritual dilemma of Zosimas is that he is impure in a spiritual way. He sins not with his body, but with his mind. His sins are based on what you would call in French la vaine gloire. He thinks that he's better than everybody else, that he already knows that he's gone as far as he can go on this path towards saintliness. So his presence in Rutebeuf's version of Mary of Egypt's life shows an opposition between the sins of the body and of the mind. His transformation is less extreme than Mary's, but he's necessary also to bear witness to her saintliness, and he learns through her example that one can always push penitence and mortification of the body a little bit further. So to conclude, we have seen that the many complications regarding the body of Mary of Egypt is possibly the source of her spiritual malady or the expression of it. Her body is stained but beautiful and misleading. It becomes ugly while she repents and punishes herself, and becomes beautiful again upon her death. In reading medieval saint stories, we see that all saints must subjugate their bodies to liberate their soul. But women who become saints have a more complicated trajectory, in part because of possibly the opinions of the medieval church on the female body and its place in society. It's for this reason that beauty is so important in the story of female saints. Women are in some ways the instrument and tool of devils, and beauty rarely brings a saint happiness. In the story of converted sinners, natural beauty is deceptive, and saintly persons must transform and transcend their bodies, erasing their natural beauty to attain a divine beauty of which God is the source. Thank you.